जय जगन्नाथ वंदे उत्कल जननी संवाद ग्रुप्र परिचालना निर्देशिका श्रीमती मोनिका नायर पट्टनायक युव संपादिका श्रीमती तनया पट्टनायक आज उत्सव मुख्य अतिथि युव एवं कुशल मंत्री श्रीयुक्त प्रीति रंजन घड़ाई एठारे समवेत मोर गुरुजन मान नमस्कार जो माने मोर समवयस्क से मोर अभिनंदन एवं जो मैंने मोटू सान से मोर आशीर्वाद एवं शुभेच्छा। युवा संपादिका तनया पट्टनायक भाषण शुणी मुझे प्रोत्साहित हो गली जे किछि शब्द ओडिया रे कहबा चेष्टा करी। छात्र जीवन रे अनर्गल ओडिया रे भाषण देवार अभ्यास थिला। लोक मान मंत्रमुग्ध करुथली कि नहीं जानेनी किंतु किछि प्रशंसार पात्र निश्चित भाव में होउथली। 40 वर्ष ओडिया बाहर ओडिशा बाहर रहिबा परे पृथ्वी रे चारिआडे बुली बुली ओडिया भाषा से भाषण द्वारा अभ्यासटा चलीगला। तेणु प्रथम आज संवाद ग्रुप को मुझे कृतज्ञता दूची जे मते एभली गोटे अनुष्ठान एवं गोटे प्लाटफर्म देले जो थे मु पुणी ओडिया भाषा सहित रिकनेक्ट करी भाषण देवार से सुजोग पाई पारिबी। पंडित गोदावरीश महापात्रंकर से कवितार पंक्ति मनरे आसुची जे हुए तो ये प्लाटफर्म पाई मो निजर हृत गौरव घृत गौरव मृत गौरव जो थिला भाषण देवार से गौरव सेटा फेरी पाई बोली मु आशा करे। आपण मानकर अनुमति सहित जदि आपण मानक अनुमति हम ताले मोर ओडिया भाषार परीक्षा आपण मानक ऊपर ज्यादा न करी मु वर्तमान इंग्लिश आई स्विच ओवर टू गौरहरि बाबू को आसवा आगु पचारुली जे गौरहरि बाबू ब्रांड रो ओडिया कौन। गौरहरि बाबू कहले ब्रांड रो ओडिया नहीं जमती जैकेट रो ओडिया नहीं। तेणु ओडिया भाषा सम्मुखें प्रथम ये गोटे आम चैलेंज रहिला जे विभिन्न इंग्राजी शब्द जो गुड़ाक आम बारंबार यूज करुचे तार ओडिया इक्विवेलेंट कौन ताकू खोजी काढ़ा। संवाद पत्र एथरे बहुत भूमिका अच्छी। मु आशा करे जे संवाद एथरे नेतृत्व नहीं ये शब्दर सबू परिभाषा नुआ बाहर करिवो। I must say that I am very delighted today and honored to be here with you on the 7th edition of your Brands of Odisha and Pride of India Awards. And this is an exceptional example of how an idea called excellence can be institutionalized. You have actually institutionalized this idea of excellence. I recall the late chairman of Aditya Birla Group, late Aditya Birla, with whom I never had the honor and privilege of working. He had said one sentence, that excellence comes out of small things, and excellence is no small thing. And therefore, it is a great, great tradition that you have chosen to institute these awards in name of corporate excellence. But what I truly appreciate even more than that corporate excellence is a holistic thing, but you have chosen one lens to look at corporate excellence, which is brands. It is very unusual for a small state like Odisha to think about brands being the driver or co-driver of corporate excellence, given the fact that brands often in relatively low per capita income states, brands are not looked upon as drivers of economy. We all look at more bottom of the pyramid mass products. So I congratulate you for doing that. More importantly, what struck me is what Monica ji mentioned here, that you are recognizing small, micro and middle enterprises. Many of you may not know that 28 million small, medium enterprises in the US account for more than 50% of the sales of US. 28 million. I do not have the equivalent numbers for India today, how many small, medium enterprises account for how much of sales in India. But the day is not very far when we will find that the small, medium enterprises are going to be the key drivers of our economy. It is also gratifying for me to note that while recognizing wide cross sectors, manufacturing, consulting you mentioned today, IT and others, you also have chosen to treat CSR as a brand. Because the way the world is moving today, without caring for stakeholders are around, without caring for the community in which we live, there is no future for societies or our civilization. Therefore, it is also very, very gratifying that you have chosen to look at CSR as a brand. The question comes, what is an excellent company? And to my mind, an excellent company or excellent business or excellent institution is one that has done well enough for long enough. The problem is, many well enough organizations do not last long enough. Many of those who last long enough do not do well enough. And therefore, the spirit of true excellence is when you do well enough and you do it for long enough. And perhaps, you should be proud in SAMBAD that you have been epitomizing some of that for having done long enough and well enough. I was a student when the first edition perhaps came up. Today I'm at the end of my professional career, and I still find the institution is thriving, surviving, and growing. The question is, a lot of the time we define excellent organizations, particularly business organizations, by how much of shareholder return they have created. What is the return on capital employed? We judge it by how many people they employed. What's the net worth? But what is important we often forget is that most value embedded in an organization is not in its physical assets, but in its intangible assets. Call it the values, call it the culture, call it the people, call it the competence, call it the brands. Many of the time when mergers and acquisitions happen, those of you who are more connected with business would realize that in mergers, acquisitions, in balance sheet, there is always an entry called goodwill. And goodwill is nothing but that embedded intangible that is there in the organization, which often in many organizations consists of brands and equivalent. But one of the mistakes that we could make in Odisha, or for that matter many global corporations make, is that they do not think that it is, or rather they make the mistake of thinking that it is always easy to do well enough for long enough. And that is how, if you go back to the famous work of Tom Peters and Waterman about In Search of Excellence, where they studied 43 of Fortune 500 companies that were, in their assessment, were doing exceptionally well, somewhere in early 90s. Out of that, 20% don't exist today, 33% are struggling, and the rest have obviously sustained. Similarly, another great author, Jim Collins, wrote 2 books. One is somewhere in 2006, which was called Good to Great, and the another book he wrote called Built to Last. All of them tried to study, interestingly, that what makes a great company, and do they sustain, and what makes them sustain. But a very interesting research by certain Harvard researchers that published an article, they studied the financial performance of from 1966 till 2010, 1966 to 2010, of 25,000 US companies to find out, and they categorize companies into 2 categories called miracle workers and long runners. They sell all those who are in the top 10% of return on assets, they call them as miracle workers. And those who delivered return on assets between 20 to 40% in that 25,000 number of companies, they call them long runners. And they found that between those who delivered higher return on their assets, there were 2 distinguishing characteristics. First is better than cheaper, which means that you need to have a differentiation strategy. And second was revenue over cost. Many times, we find that many companies go on doing cost cutting, and don't misunderstand me. It is important to cut costs to be competitive. But costs can be cut only to that point. So revenue has to be a primary driver of your excellence, and we got to find an interesting way to drive revenue. You will find in American business, even romance today is used to drive revenue. There's a famous young singer called Taylor Swift. You may have heard her name. Taylor Swift has been a chartbuster for many, many years. She's one of the leading women singers. All her music is on top of the chart. Those who are young, those who are 50 plus, you may not have heard of her. Those who are 50 and below perhaps have heard. I see a young lady nodding her head there. Thank you, ma'am. Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce, who is a 2-time Super Bowl champion, they seem to have a relationship. What happened is that when Taylor Swift appears at a Super Bowl, which is American football, more and more young women who do not like the physicality of American football started coming into the game. the revenue went up. And Travis Kelce's jerseys or T-shirts, whose sales were dipping, they started going up. An interesting way to expand your revenue, as you see, ladies and gentlemen. So the question, therefore, is, Tom Peters and Robert Waterman's work of In Search of Excellence focused on 7 S's. Talked about strategy, systems, skill, shared values, staff, and all of that. But the problem, the world we live in today, is that it's a dynamic world. And in a dynamic world, the context is all the time changing. Therefore, taking a static view of what you need to do is not going to keep us excellent. So what got you here is not going to take you there. What's brought SAMBAD from 1980s till 2023 is not going to take SAMBAD to 2057 unless SAMBAD continues to reinvent itself. And that is what is true about excellent organizations. Most excellent organizations have learned how to learn. And learning how to learn is not the easiest thing. As you grow older as an individual, or as you grow older as a corporation, it becomes harder and harder to learn how to learn. But if Charles Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, which we call, actually that's not what Charles Darwin said, he said it's the adaptive who survive the most. And therefore, adaptiveness is nothing but the ability to learn. So we need to ask ourselves, and particularly those of you who are winning awards today, who have won awards in the last 6 editions, is to continuously ask questions to yourself. If you are a promoter, you are a CEO, you are a CXO, you are a leader, or encourage your teams to ask that question, what is that in last 12 months, 18 months, 24 months that we have done new in order to improve our adaptability to the changed circumstances? And if at all we want to continue to do things that were traditionally done, let's remember one thing when we talk about brands. I saw that Dharmendra Babu referring to it a little bit. But at one level, it doesn't surprise me that, sorry, my throat is a bit bad. I've been down with a bit of typical throat problem. Apologize for sipping water in between. It doesn't surprise me that a lot of entrepreneurs are building brands in Odisha today, because Odisha in some ways has been a land of brands. Lord Jagannath is biggest brand and biggest brand ambassador of Odisha. Obhada has been a brand. Rath Yatra is a brand. Dhauli Stupa is a brand. Surya Mandir in Konark is a brand. We have been full of brands of many kinds, so it doesn't surprise me. But the important question is that we need to learn to figure out that going forward, as we build brands, the brands need to be productive and companies need to be productive. McKinsey Consulting's one global study by their McKinsey Institute said that if the low productive organizations could convert into high productive organizations, global economy will expand by $50 trillion. $50 trillion. We are looking very proudly that India could become a $5 trillion. But imagine simply by moving from low productivity to high productivity, we could add to global economy by $50 trillion. The question, therefore, as excellent companies or brand builders for us is how to make our brands work, how to make our companies work to be more and more productive. Turning to brands, I looked at Nielsen research to find that globally, there are apparently 500,000 brands spread over 2,000 products or product categories. In India, I looked at it and I found that there are 30,000 small and medium brands that serve 80% of Indian population. As Indian economy grows and per capita GDP grows, the tendency to look at brands, both in very simple products like edible oil that Mr. Reddy has been spearheading, or many of you, whether it's a tourism product or anything, it will keep on growing. And brands are possible in all categories. There are sector brands. There was a time in my childhood when we say Cadbury, we basically refer to chocolate. Irrespective of what chocolate we bought, we said, "Do Cadbury de dena." He used to give anything, the shopkeeper. But we believed it was Cadbury. That was a sector brand. We have corporate brands. The only corporate brand globally perhaps today from India is Tata's as a brand. There are no other brand that's there. There are service brands. We say, okay, I'll FedEx it to you. Now, even if you send another courier, you still call it, I'll FedEx it to you. It's a service brand. I will Uber myself. Now, you might take some other cab service, but you call yourself, I Uber myself. That's a service brand. There are places that are brands. We say Lord's is the Makkah of cricket. Now Makkah becomes a brand. Maybe tomorrow Ayodhya will become a brand. I don't know. They'll say Ayodhya of cricket. I don't know. Maybe. Individuals are brands. A very generous industrialist some years ago described me as Amitabh Bachchan of HR now. Now it's interesting. Like personally, if I look at myself, how does a brand work? I have been a CEO for 14 years. I ran 2 businesses of $4.5 billion, 30 factories in 20 countries. But still I'm introduced as former HR director of Aditya Birla Group because that's my brand, So the question is, we need to ask this question as we build brand, that what is a brand? I believe David Ogilvy, the father of advertising and branding, said, brand is nothing but that unique image or personality you create about a product, a service, or a corporate, or an individual, or a theater, drama, whatever that you call. If you create that, that is the brand. The 4 leading brands of the world, if you look at Amazon today, and many of us make the mistake of believing that brands only are meant for consumer products. Amazon started as a B2B, moved to B2C. It's both a B2B and B2C brand. That's the most valuable brand today. Next one is Apple, perhaps, and following that by Google, and followed that by perhaps Microsoft. But if you look at Google, it stands out how it creates its brand. If you look at 2 of Google's competitors, there was something called Yahoo, which still exists, and there was something called AOL, American Online. Both American Online and Yahoo sold their screen space as real estate property by accepting advertisement. But you go to Google's page, there is no advertisement. It built its brand by saying to people that I want to be a convenience brand for you. Now that was the uniqueness about Google, how it positioned. So all brand builders have to ask this question, what does differentiate me? Because don't forget to the study that I referred to earlier, that differentiation is the key strategy and the revenue growth is the next strategy to be kind of an exceptional company. And therefore, as other brands died, many brands died also, many brands were killed, brands have to be renewed, refreshed, and all of that. In the age of ChatGPT, in the age of artificial intelligence, in the age of internet, in the age of media influencers, in the age of communities. Now, earlier there was a process that we used to advertise our products quite a lot. Today on internet, what works is user-generated content. What does that mean? If this bottle of water is consumed by 50 of us, if we all voluntarily write something about this water and how it satisfies us, it becomes user-generated content. Many of you associate McDonald's and Burger King for the speed of their service. Interestingly, Burger King is repositioning its activities to say, actually, it is not necessarily the speed. The feeling of speed is becoming important. Their research tells them that if the staff is friendly, people believe that the service has been fast, even if it is taking 2 minutes late, longer. How do you get and garner consumer insights of that kind? To build brands that will reflect contemporary consumer mindset. Today you find consumer activism. Recently I read about an African singer whose name I would not take. He is suing a large alcohol brand or a company like Diageo, believing that 2 of its brands of that company, where he features in advertising, are not being adequately supported with brand investment because there is a racial bias against him. Imagine this situation. There is activism about pashmina, there is activism about plastic, there is activism about child labor, gender discrimination. So while building brand, one needs to keep that in mind, that there are multiple issues that impact a brand, and the way consumers are consuming brands, experiencing brands. Lot of ordinary things today you never heard of. We used to go and buy what's that called, tap or plastic pipe or whatever, tile or something. from any shop. Hardware stores, they were called in my childhood. Even in Odia, they used to write hardware store, you know. Maybe there was no Odia equivalent of what hardware is. But today, you go to buy the same thing, you have experience center. Now, what does that mean? You have to buy a tap at the end of the day. But people give an experience because the technology around taps and, you know, the showers and all getting very, very complicated. When I go to these fancy hotels in America, the first thing I do is to figure out where the cold water or hot water comes because this is very complicated technology. So ladies and gentlemen, the message and the point I want to leave with you is, A, brand building is important. B, brand building is not a static activity. C, brands need to stay in step with consumers and the trends that are happening in the world. We cannot take product services in name of branding and advertising in the same way as we were thinking 20, 30 years ago, because the nature of technology and the technology's access to consumers is changing. And I hope while you celebrate your success, which you have rightly deserved, rightly won, you will continue to think about these aspects to make yourself, your company, your people, the state of Odisha proud. And I hope that SAMBAD continues this tradition of promoting brands, giving encouragement, and you all to have the courage to build newer brands to make all of us proud and economically moving forward and rich. Thank you very much for having me, and God bless. Jai Jagannath.